without much ado, and after a sumptuous meal of barbecue and all the shrimps and all the feasts that we have today, not only for the mind but for the soul and for the especially for the tummy, we'd like to give you something very, very special tonight. At ito po we are so fortunate that no less than our Consul General of the Republic of the Philippines is with us today. Ladies and gentlemen, palakpakan po natin ang todo-todo. Our beloved, much loved, and always all out for the Filipino community in Japan, and he has traveled in almost, sir, 25 na ba ang prefectures na napuntahan po ninyo?
Hindi pa umaabot.
Malapit na.
24 pa lang daw yun.
Malapit na.
24. Okay, hold on to your seats because it's going to give you a vault. Ladies and gentlemen, sir, pinag-practicean ko ito. Ladies and gentlemen, our Consul General Voltaire D. Mauricio.
Hello, good day. How are you?
Ay, tosi kayo tumago.
If your questions is about passporting, please press 1. If your question is about notarial, please press 2. And for any other queries, please press 3. If you notice, when I'm saying that, actually it's a continuation of what I first said. Hello, good day. And then it proceeds to that one. Why? Because I'm now referring to technology. When I first heard that, it was something alien to me. That you're talking to a machine. For people who are in my generations and those who are older than me, that is something that is very unusual when you first hear about it. Of course, for the new generations now and the succeeding generations, it's something normal. They deal with it, they talk, they do it, and eventually things go on. The Filipino culture, however, is heavily resistant on that type of technology. Why? Because we rely on talking to another person on the phone. And that gives you an idea of how people-oriented Filipinos are. And this is true with respect to many posts. The resistance of talking to a machine is something that the common Filipino abroad, and probably in the Philippines more so, is not used to. That's the resistance that you encounter in the different posts. I don't have to go far because I myself don't like talking to the phone. That aspect of technology has impersonalized human relations. Which is the reason why in the Philippine Consulate, in our office, we make it a point that the most common medium of communicating is the hotline. Because there's a person at the other end of the line. Now, I'm mentioning this to you because you have to balance system and people. But we have to tilt more or lean more towards people rather than the system. This kind of system, while it's important because you need to process volumes of transactions and queries, we also have to realize that there has to be a personal aspect when you deal with output. And that's the reason why I want to mention it to you. Because you have to balance between receiving phone calls personally and dealing with the time factor so that the chances of receiving the different phone calls from our kababayans can be equitably distributed. Why? Because as I said, part of that culture of wanting to talk to another person can also lean towards, because of limited human resource, towards not being able to serve others. And this happened in many instances, not only in the post, but also in the home office, in the department. when you talk to a Filipino, if you don't control them, they not only ask the weather, they talk about showbiz, they talk about politics, and before you know it, the crucial focus of what they're asking for is already gone and time has elapsed. So you have to limit it's somewhere in between. That's where systems and technology is, and why we should focus on leaning towards orientation of human relationships. And that's where leadership comes in. Because when leaders focus only on output and effectivity or efficiency, most of the time, if a leader is not careful, the system is the focus of what they're doing to improve, and they're marginalizing human relationships. And the leader can never be effective, however good the output is, if the team in the office internally is under constant pressure and stress, or the people that you're trying to service is marginalized. That's the first message that I'd like to tell you today on leadership. When you do a decision based on the output or productivity or production of your office, and you're the leader of your organization, of your community, don't forget the people, which is the thing that needs to be served by the systems. When I mention people, we're not talking of output of people served. We're talking of relationships, which is the most important for me. I have to premise that to you precisely because when I go later on to the discussion of leadership in your specific field, in relationship to our office, Philippine government and the Philippine consulate and all its team, including labor, you have to know what the priorities are and how we are conducting our relationship with you. So we go with basic snippets of knowledge that I'd like to share with you. Why? Because I know for a fact, and this goes from my experience when I was still in London, that the Filipino community have certain assumptions as to what the Philippine government through its posts, the Philippine consulate, the labor, is all about. But it's not entirely accurate. And sometimes their perception is vastly different from the reality of what we are. So I'll give you very basic information in this meet and greet so that you can understand what our office is and who we are. This is very important to settle several questions. Sir, what's the difference between an ambassador and a consul general? Very basic thing. But most people don't know it because there may be a technical aspect related to this. So, sir, are you also an ambassador? Sir, what is an embassy? What is a consulate? Why do you call it a consulate general? Sir, what does really an ambassador do? So, these are questions that are basic. But I noticed that many people in our community are reluctant to ask because they don't want to appear that they're ignorant. But learning and asking questions is something that you should never fail to do. For in your mind, the most simplest or most foolish questions, they're actually fundamental questions. And I'm going to address it today. And please, if you're not tired and you want to ask more questions, I will answer it. The Department of Foreign Affairs has a mandate as one of the department in the executive branch of government. I'm not going to tell you about a refresher of the three departments in our Republican form of government and how this becomes a check and balance to each other. Legislative, which is Congress, Judiciary, which is the Supreme Court, and you have the executive, headed by the President, with all the different departments. I'm not going to do that to you unless you ask later or tomorrow. I can give you a very simplified version of how it works. But the Department of Foreign Affairs is in the executive branch. The mandate of the Department of Foreign Affairs is actually summarized into this simple statement. The mandate is to protect and promote Philippine interest abroad. That's it. It's to protect and promote Philippine interests abroad. And when you're referring as to what Philippine interests abroad are, you're talking about two things. People, we have to protect our people, and our political and economic interests. The people protection is actually just an afterthought when it started several decades ago. Because when you're talking of diplomacy, when you're referring to national interest or Philippine interest abroad, you're only talking of political interest or economic interest or consular interest. That's it. Okay? So there's a clear demarcation in the traditional sense of old school diplomacy between political interest, which is diplomatic, and consular interest, which is other than political. That includes economic, that includes consular, that includes all the other things. So, when you refer to those interests, two things define what you do with those interests. One, protection. And two, promotion of Philippine interest with respect to trade. That's one, primarily and historically. Protection with respect to our territory, South China Sea. With respect to trade and economic also, with respect to our sovereignty. Those are political interests. And then, of course, the third, which is actually the first now for the Department of Foreign Affairs, where Pina and I become partners, would be people. Protection of the Filipino people abroad as a Philippine interest defined first and foremost. And this developed historically recently during the time of floor contemplation in Singapore. Because before that time, there were still only two, basically, interests or pillars of the foreign policy, the DFA. That's only political and economic or consular. Philippine assistance to national was a third, undefined third leg. It's an undefined leg. Now, it's different. It's the first one. Because the people, they're the most important aspect of our nation building and what our national interest is. Tayo, mga tao. So, during the floor contemplation, that shook off the Philippine government structure, especially in foreign policy, that you have to put the people first to be protected before you promote them. So, that came as a readjustment to the old mistake of promoting the export of people to other countries without considering that they should be protected when they're already exported into those countries. Because once you export people in the Middle East, in some of the other places where they are abused and there's not enough social safety networks to protect them, you should not be promoting them in the first place. So there's a shift in priority on protection, not promotion. And that's how it works in the mandate, protection and promotion of Philippine interests abroad. Now, that's the mandate of DFA. It has to be abroad because within the Philippines, other executive departments will come into play. If it's education, of Philippine interests as education, domestically, that's the Department of Education. If it's labor, that's PINA's department. So all of those things, but abroad, for all the interests abroad, Department of Foreign Affairs. Now, how do we define it? You define it basically and traditionally by what you refer to as bilateral relationships. Bilateral. Two sides. Bilateral. Lateral is side. Bi is two. So, it's a relationship between two entities or two countries. That originally was formally and customarily developed by the French during the times of the kingdoms, when we didn't have countries, when we didn't have states. All of us began as kingdoms. And the basic proof of that is still found in our children's books. How do our children's books begin? Because these are the oldest repository of stories, children's books. Once upon a time, in a kingdom far, far away, kingdom. They don't say country. There lived a king, or a queen, or a prince. So you're talking of a monarchic state, kingdoms. Kingdoms, basically, are ruled by monarchs. And these monarchs basically own everyone within their kingdom. When you have several kingdoms, and these kingdoms border each other, you have conflicts. That's why you have wars between kingdoms. The more kingdoms fight, the more other kingdoms win, they take over other kingdoms. If you have a kingdoms who have been battling other kingdoms and eventually becoming a super kingdom, you call them an empire. That's the reason why, up to now, one of the oldest monarchies, the United Kingdom, is actually an aggregation of three basic kingdoms. The Kingdom of England, the Kingdom of Scotland, and the Kingdom of Wales. They became united because they got tired of fighting each other and realized they cannot beat each other. Let's just join forces and conquer other kingdoms outside of our jurisdiction. So you have the United Kingdom of Great Britain. So Great Britain is defined by these three kingdoms. And later on, with the addition, it's a long name, the United Kingdoms of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. That's the full name. Because Northern Ireland was not a kingdom. Why? Because Ireland in itself was a kingdom. But they divided it into two. That's another story. I'm just telling you that they became an empire because they keep on conquering and they keep on winning several kingdoms at a time. Digressing, when kingdoms get tired of fighting with each other, what did they do? And this is the antecedent in Europe. When kingdoms fought against each other, sometimes it depletes their resources, both of them. So what do? They usually send hostages to each other. And those hostages that they send in exchange are actually related to them. My brother, my sister, I send it to the next kingdom. The next kingdom will also send the brother or the sister or the son. These were the first ambassadors. They were actually hostages. You do something on my border, okay, I'm going to kill your brother. These were the first ambassadors. They were hostages. Or I'm going to kill your son. Or whoever that's in that kingdom. You understand? That's the basic origin of diplomacy. As the French did it. Because when you have different hostages from your neighboring kingdoms, that's where multilateral relationships started, from bilateral relationships. And they live within the court of the king so that they're protected. And because they are there representing the king from another kingdom, when they're there in that kingdom, they are treated as if they were the king or the queen of the kingdom that they come from. That's the reason why in modern parlance, only two types of officers that you refer to as your excellency. Who? The president of a state or a nation and the ambassador when he's assigned to another country that's hosting him. They're the only two people that you can refer to as your excellency. Think about it. Do you know of any other? None. That's the historical basis for it. Because an ambassador is the king or the president of that country when he's assigned abroad. Now let me explain. That's also the origin of embassies. When you're talking of embassies, they are actually the place where an ambassador is located. That's the historical definition. So, an embassy historically is not the place where the ambassador goes to exercise his official function. Historically, it is wherever the ambassador is. You call that place an embassy. The office you can call a chancery. But the embassy will always be where the ambassador is, doing his official function. So, what is an embassy? An embassy is where the ambassador, as the head of state of the country where he represents, works and disposes of his functions. And what's his function? To protect and promote the national interests abroad for his country. It's as simple as that. Now, where do you assign ambassadors? You can only assign ambassadors in capitals of the country. That's the general and almost absolute rule. That's the reason why there are no embassies, except on 2 instances. There are no embassies in countries outside of their capital. There's only one glaring exception to that, Israel. Why? Because there was a pressure at that time when they created Israel from the oil-producing Islamic countries not to recognize politically Israel. And they had the oil. So they had to move that capital, not the capital, they had to move the embassies and place the embassies in Tel Aviv, which is not the capital of Israel. The capital is Jerusalem. But Tel Aviv is where all the embassies are located, quote-unquote embassies. You cannot really call them embassies technically. That's the only exception. Why? Because when you establish bilateral relationships, it has to be capital to capital. So, here, you don't have an embassy in Osaka or Nagoya. You can only have it in Tokyo because that's the capital of Japan. And if you set up an embassy, you also have an ambassador. What do you call an ambassador? You call him as an AEP. You've heard of that term?
No.
AEP. They referred to as Ambassador Extraordinary and Plenipotentiary. That's the full title of an ambassador. AEP. What does that mean? It means you're an ambassador, extraordinary, and plenipotentiary. You're exercising the full powers of a president. Of a president. You're president. So when you're assigned in an embassy, you are the president of the Philippines. That's why you're called Your Excellency, and you have all the powers of the president. That's how powerful an ambassador is by historical tradition. So let me define where the AEP comes from. Extraordinary because it's not a mere representative of the president or the republic. He is the president. Extraordinary. Plenipotentiary, that comes from 2 Latin words, plenum and potens. Plenum means full. Hail Mary, full of grace. Ave Maria, Gracia plena. Plenum, full. Gracia, full of grace. Gracia plena. Plenipotentiary, plenum, full. What's full? Full, potens, powers. So this ambassador or this person has full powers. He's extraordinary because of his status, and he has full powers. What gives him full powers? Let me ask you, what gives an ambassador full powers? His ability to bind the Republic of the Philippines without permission. So if he signs a treaty that binds the Republic of the Philippines, that's full powers. Others, like ministers, they have to get an authority from the president to sign a bilateral or a treaty, bilateral agreement or a treaty, or a multilateral agreement. Bakit? Kasi hindi sila full powers. But an ambassador, he has full powers. That's the reason why when you present an ambassador or assign him to another country, he goes through 2 processes. The first one is the agreement. When you present the name, the other country that is you're sending him to have to agree. You call that an agreement. Have to agree that we will accept him para hindi magkahiyaan. Once he agrees, okay, his letters of credentials, that's the second point, is presented to the head of state. Not the Secretary of Foreign Affairs, but the President of that state, or the Emperor for that matter in Japan. You present the credentials. Why? Because you are now telling Japan that whatever this ambassador is going to sign binds the Republic of the Philippines. You cannot anymore withdraw that. To some extent, you can. But general rule, it's almost absolute. When he signs, at sira ulo yung ambassador mo, it binds the Philippines. You got it? I have to tell these things to you kasi these are basic fundamental knowledge for the ordinary diplomat like me and Pina. But it's an uncommon knowledge to most other Filipinos. Now you know what an ambassador is. Full powers. And that's the reason why some of my colleagues decided to join the Department of Foreign Affairs. Anong sabi nila? Pare, alam ko naman, di naman ako magiging presidente ng Pilipinas. Mag-ambassador na lang ako sa karir. At least pareho namang your excellency yan. Di pa ako gumastos. You got it?
Hindi pa siya nangipan niya.
Okay. So that's what an ambassador is, ladies and gentlemen. It's a full recognition of the other country by having bilateral relationship through the setting up of embassies and sending of mutual ambassadors, which had its weird beginnings that I already told you. Those are mutual hostages. Okay. You have questions on that aspect? Okay, and now proceed. What are consulates? Consulates are similar to embassies actually. It's headed by a consul general. So what's the difference between an embassy and a consulate general? And what's the difference between an ambassador and a person like me, a consul general? The difference is there's only one president recognized for a particular country and he lives in the capital. He's an ambassador. All the other heads of the different posts, you cannot call them embassies and you cannot call them ambassadors. They're only consul generals. And what do they have or don't have that the embassies or ambassadors have? Traditionally, what we don't have is the power of diplomacy. We only have the power of consular supervision. That's the reason why we're called consulates. And that's the reason why I'm called consul general. At the end of the day, from a historical perspective, I can just do consular work. And I told you that there are two types of work that an embassy does. The political work and the others. The others would be economic, trade, consular, all those things, that's consular. Historically, anything not political is consular. Including economic, including trade, including labor, whatever it was, historically, it's consular. That's what I do. So, technically, I cannot be referred to as diplomat. As a diplomat. I can be referred to as a consular officer. Because a diplomat will only be those that are working in the embassy. Osaka is a hybrid because they have diplomatic activities here. This is also the first time that I encountered where we have an ambassador, a Japanese ambassador for Kansai. It's a very strange and weird structure, but only in Japan. And I've asked about it from the Kansai ambassador, who's part of the career of the Gaimusho. What is this about? And this has actually something to do with clothing, diplomatic cover the Kansai region, which was a center of trade and which also covers its historical capital, Kyoto. So you're talking of Kyoto and Kobe, actually, more than Osaka, historically. So they had to assign because the important historical prefectures and cities are here. So I have that. So I find myself in that unusual hybrid situation only here in Japan. So that's what a consulate is. And part of those consular activities historically includes economic interests, trade interests. And then later on, it diversified into other interests like labor and tourism. So anyone who does work in an embassy before that is consular in nature would be defined by what they do. If it is purely, strictly, traditionally consular, which is issuances of passports, issuances of visas to the nationals of the foreign country, like in this case, the Japanese, when we issue long-term visas, those are consular activities. Report of birth, notarials, those are consular services. So those are strict consular work. But the other consular work, like trade, like what do you call this? Tourism, like labor, when they are working in the embassies, you know, the French are very snobbish. So historically, they don't consider, quote unquote, those part of the embassy because they're not doing political work. So what do they call them? They're not part, but they're attached. So the term attaché, which is a French word, comes in. He's a trade attaché. He's a labor attaché. I'm talking of the historical reference. It's not anymore the same now. Because I told you, the work of labor is more important than diplomatic work. Because at the time that the floor contemplation incident exploded in Singapore, it caused the heads of 2 department secretaries to roll. The Labor Secretary Nieves Confesor and the DFA Foreign Secretary Roberto R. Romulo, who passed away. They lost their jobs. Why? They were both focused on the old school. That radically shifted. It's a tectonic shift in Philippine foreign policy. Okay, so while they may be referred to as attachés even up to now, they don't mean the same thing as the attachés of the old time. Ano ba ang attachés? If it's a body, our body, they're what we are referred to as, including me, consular, what we are referred to as the appendix. Irrelevant, naka-attach lang, pero walang significance as far as the diplomats are concerned. You understand? Okay. So that's the difference between what a consulate is, what a consul general is, and what an ambassador is. All the consul general would be under the direct supervision and control of the ambassador. Now you understand? So I have to explain this to you so you know what is our role. We don't study treaties. We don't do things related to the South China Sea in a consulate because those are diplomatic functions in nature. We leave it to the experts in the embassies who deal directly also with the gaimusyo in terms of the diplomatic or political aspect. Now, having said those things in terms of what these people are, I don't want us to go into the legal fiction because a lot of people get trapped with the legal fiction. What's the legal fiction? The legal fiction is the concept brought in by the French. You don't deal with a person, you deal with an entity. So you're actually dealing with the Philippine embassy, you're dealing with the Japanese foreign ministry, and when something bad happens, it's really the institution. For me, that's bullshit because behind this institution, you have the people, and that's where I go back. People and relationships are important. While you can look at things from the perspective of structures, from the perspective of the legal fiction of entities, behind those entities lies people who would run their offices. And that's the reason why people and relationships for me would be important. I can go on and on, but it's already 10. I just wanted to give you a brief of what you need to know so that you can appreciate when you see me who you're dealing with. I'm not the ambassador. I'm the consul general. And I find it pretentious that I'm also called Congen because basically I'm just a person. And when you're dealing with me, I'm just Vol, your friend. And if you need my help, come to me, ask me something, I'll give it to you as a person and as a friend. And that's the bottom line of leadership. When we deal with our respective Filipino communities and its members, don't forget that it's people relationship, which is distinctly Filipino, part of our culture. Ladies and gentlemen, good evening.
Wala na akong masabi.
Magpapaquiz na lang ako.
Magpapala.